Good morning, church. Isn't it heartwarming to see the father-son combo leading in worship? Thank you, Lee and Colt, for leading us this morning. Good morning to everyone. If you're wondering what's going on with the giant void right in front and center in the middle of the auditorium this morning, well, that is because, of course, this morning is the beginning of Wilderness Trek. Our teenagers have taken a trip to Colorado, where at least as far as the plan was concerned, and we all know that when Andy makes the plan, sometimes they change, okay? At least the plan was that the teens would be worshiping this morning from overlooking the Royal Gorge Canyon in Colorado. Wouldn't that be a thing to see? And here you are in Arkansas. Well, I'm glad that you're here. Of course, I was talking to Andy about this trip. This is a picture from last year's trek and the hiking that they did there. Of course, I'm sure you're sweating just looking at them. Of course, they went up to, I believe, Wyoming last year. This year, they're in Colorado, and they're prepared to hike in some snowy conditions. And here we are, whereas I believe outside, if you brought a spoon, you could just feel, like you could just cut the air. It's like soup, isn't it? It's like swimming out there in that humidity. Quite a far cry from where they are at this morning. I was talking to Andy a few days ago about Trek, and of course, this is the first year that our new youth minister, Kennedy, is joining the crew on Trek. And let me go ahead and tell you, Kennedy was worried about it. He's not quite built for the outdoors in the same way that Andy is, bless his heart. But being a good sport, he was going to go along, and he was walking around this week in his brand new hiking boots, trying to break them in a little bit before the trip. Whereas our new youth intern, Ethan, borrowed my worn-out pair of hiking boots. So there's the difference between being the youth minister and the youth intern. One of them gets to buy brand new boots, and the other has to borrow the preacher's worn-out boots that barely fit. Well, of course, I was talking to Andy. What are you going to do if some of these people who have never hiked before have trouble making it through this arduous journey that they have? And what I meant by that was I was a little worried about Kennedy, okay? A little worried about Kennedy, and he said, well, we've got some things that we do where we try to help each other out. We've got some things that we do to help. In fact, we try to encourage those who are a little bit more capable and are managing their load better than others to take up the slack for some of those who might be struggling. And he said, as much as possible, I try to let it be an organic thing. I want to see a student notice that another is struggling and offer to help them. And Andy said, unfortunately, most of the time, that's not quite what happens. He said, I typically have to do a little bit of prodding, a little bit of encouraging. Hey, it looks like Kennedy's struggling a little bit. Why don't you offer to grab a little bit from his pack? And I said, so what do you do? What are the first things that a person would grab to help somebody who's struggling on this big hiking excursion? And he said, it's typically the stuff on the exterior of the pack. Maybe it's a pair of shoes that's dangling by the shoelaces, and with every step, it just swings back and forth, dangling around, and it just really starts to wear you out after a while. He said sometimes it's fuel canisters or water jugs, or it's the pots and pans. And Andy said that sometimes some folks have some pride that's wrapped up in this. Some don't want to turn over part of their pack to others. How many of you would have trouble accepting help from others? Yeah, certainly. Some of you would, myself included, even if everybody's got to hear my groaning and complaining, every step up the mountain, I'm going to do it myself, right? And he said, Andy sometimes has to convince a kid to say, listen, it's okay to admit that you need a little bit of help right now. There will be a time where you will be strong. There will be a time where you're the one able to help others, but right now, you need to let Asa help you, for example. Well, this morning, if you would, continue to pray this week for our teens and our youth ministers, youth staff, who are away on their big hiking adventure trek in Colorado this week. This morning, we're going to be talking about carrying one another's burdens. We're going to look at a passage from 2 Chronicles chapter 10. 2 Chronicles, I'm sure you're saying, why in the world would a person be preaching 2 Chronicles? Some of us, raise your hand if you forgot 2 Chronicles was in the Bible. Okay. I'll admit it took me a little while to find it on Monday as I was preparing for this. Of course, Paul and Kyle have been teaching about the kings of Israel and Judah over in the wilds as well, so this goes in tandem with them. Well, I'm preaching this because I'm going to be teaching about the kings of Judah to high school boys at Harding University in a couple of weeks. We've got a camp that I've been involved in for 10 years now, We've trained over 350 students in the existence of the camp. The camp is called the Caruso Experience. Now, this is a picture of Max, my friend, our poster child preacher boy, as we like to call him. And we're going to be studying 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Character in crisis is our theme, the kings of Judah. In fact, Elijah King is going to be joining us for the 2nd year in a row. Now, let's see if we can get Elijah to come and preach a sermon to us after camp this year. Yeah, I haven't told him about that yet, so that'll be fun to spring on him. In fact, I believe his cousin's joining him. I'm very excited. I begin to study the kings that I'm going to be teaching to the kids, and I'm very excited to share some of that with you this morning. If you are one of our kids here this morning and you're kind of wishing that we still had our children's worship, well, it's going to be back in just a couple of weeks, but for this morning, I've got something fun. Okay, kids, listen up. You'll notice in the activity baskets that there are a couple of little worksheets, and in fact, we might need some of the adults to help find some of the extras that I believe were in the lobbies, the entrances this morning. If some more kids need them, perhaps we can get them for them. This morning, the little worksheet, the Sermon Scavenger Hunt, has 7 or 8 questions that go along with the passage that we're studying this morning. And after worship, if you fill out your activity sheet, bring it to me in the back lobby. Kids, if you get all the answers correctly, you get to choose a prize, okay? The prize, you should really get excited about the prize. They're leftover trinkets from last year's VBS. Parents, you really want to help your kids with this activity sheet because these are exactly the kinds of prizes that are going to drive you nuts, all right? These are the kinds of prizes you can win this morning. So if you fill out your activity sheet, it goes along with 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Let's take a look at God's word. 2 Chronicles 10. This is the story of Rehoboam, the first king of the divided kingdom of Judah. This story parallels that of 1 Kings chapter 11. We're going to read the passage from 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Kids, if you need one of these, raise your hand and we'll make sure to get you tasked with one, okay? 2 Chronicles chapter 10. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and this heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Come to me again in 3 days." And so the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the old men who had stood before Solomon his father while he was yet alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" And they said to him, "If you will be good to this people and please them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever." But he abandoned the counsel that the old men gave him and took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and stood before him. And he said to them, "What do you advise?" "What do you advise?" he asked. "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke that your father put on us'?" And the young men who had grown up with him said to him, Thus you shall speak to the people who said to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but lighten it for us.' Thus shall you say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions.'" Now, what's some strong language to use on your people on your opening day in office, isn't it? My opening act in my new kingdom it's going to get a whole lot worse. Of course, he abandoned the counsel of the old men. He took up the counsel of the young men, and it's all downhill from here, isn't it? Over the next couple of chapters, we see the way that this all unfolds. Of course, we had this rebellion from Jeroboam of the northern kingdom of Israel. Jeroboam, of course, had led this rebellion. He'd fallen out of favor with Solomon. He fled to Egypt when Solomon was looking to take his life, and he comes back. He offers him an olive branch, and he says, we've got a chance here to bring the kingdom back together. And Rehoboam doesn't take it, does he? Of course, he abandons the counsel of the old men, and he takes up the counsel of his contemporaries. I'm going to be honest with you this morning as I'm preparing to help the young men at Caruso, our preacher training camp, learn how to preach the story of Rehoboam. I think there's probably 7 or 8 different sermons you could take from these 3 chapters in 2 Chronicles. The good news for you this morning is you get to hear all 7 this morning. No, I'm not going to do that. Of course, we could talk about this story from the perspective of the fact that Rehoboam had good advice, and he neglected to listen to the counsel of his elders, and instead he listened to the folks who he grew up with, right? He listened to his friends. He listened to yes men, if you will, the people who told him what he wanted to hear. Of course, there's a sermon in here. It's not the sermon I'm preaching today, which is how important it is to listen to our elders. Can I get an amen? How important it is. Where's our teenagers? See if Andy will play this sermon for them on the bus ride home. It's important to listen to our elders. It's also important for each and every one of us this morning. Perhaps you are one of our elders. It's important that we don't just surround ourselves with people who tell us what we want to hear. Are you with me? If all we ever do is listen to the people who tell us what we want to hear, we're going to think we're king of the world, aren't we? Isn't that exactly what happened to Rehoboam? Brothers and sisters, if you don't have a friend who holds an opposite opinion to you, whether it is politically, perhaps even religiously, if you don't have some Facebook friends who might get in your comments and argue with you when you say something from time to time, then I hate to break it to you, you're in an echo chamber. In fact, Jesus says if you only love people who love you, can't the Gentiles do that? Can't the pagans do that? In fact, it's important, as it would have been so important for Rehoboam to listen to those who disagreed with him. But that's not what happened, is it? There's so much more detail about Rehoboam in 2 Chronicles. There's so much more, of course, here. The book of Kings doesn't tell us a lot about Rehoboam. It gives us this story, and that's about it. Of course, Kings focuses on the kings primarily of northern Israel. Chronicles focuses on the perspective of the southern kingdom of Judah. Here we get 3 whole chapters about Rehoboam, and we learn a lot about Rehoboam, don't we? Of course, over the next couple of chapters, we get a lot more detail about what happens during his kingship, about how there is a time in which case his kingdom is strong and it thrives. At the end of the day, we get this little insightful detail later on in the story that tells us the real root of the problem with Rehoboam. Perhaps this is a sermon for another day. We learn, of course, that there was this little pocket of faithful people who remained true to the Lord, even in the midst of a kingdom led by an unfaithful king, a wicked and evil king who did not set his heart to follow the Lord, even within that kingdom. There's a good example here in 2 Chronicles chapter 11 that tells us about the Levites, those who set their hearts to seek the Lord. Of course, they came to Jerusalem to sacrifice, and we learned that God prospered Judah because there were some who were faithful. Brothers and sisters, if you feel like you're walking a walk of faith and nobody's paying attention, if you feel like nobody else is following it with you, well, the Bible tells us this, that the Lord sees, doesn't he? God notices, even if nobody else does. There's a parallel to that very passage in the next chapter in 2 Chronicles 12, whereas we learned that there were some who were faithful, who set their hearts to seek the Lord. The bottom line, when the story is written, the last words about Rehoboam, when he is gone and it's time for his funeral, this is what the Bible tells us. Well, the real problem, he did not set in his heart to seek the Lord. Brothers and sisters, before we ever find ourselves in temptation, we've got to decide, before we ever get to temptation, don't we, that we're going to seek the Lord no matter what. No matter what. All of this happens in the life of Rehoboam. There's so much that we could mine from the story of this particular king. And unfortunately, what often happens with the story of Rehoboam is it's preached from the perspective of taxes. Wouldn't this be good to preach right around April 15th? Of course, this idea of lightening our load, lightening the yoke. Many have compared the story of Rehoboam and said, well, his father, he just had too many taxes on Israel. And what Rehoboam, it's really about dollars and cents, some have said. If only he had just had fewer taxes. Did I hear an amen on that one? Okay. Well, that's perhaps not the most important lesson we ought to learn from the story of Rehoboam. You see this yoke that's referred to here in 2 Chronicles chapter 10. This yoke that's placed upon their shoulders. The yoke, they said, your father burdened us with a heavy yoke. Now would you lighten our burden? This, of course, refers to this ancient farming practice of a wooden crosspiece that's fastened over the necks of two animals, the oxen that are attached to a plow or a cart that they are to pull. The point is, what if we just lighten the load? We don't have to drag around so much equipment. We will probably prosper as a country. After all, Solomon saw a lot of growth in the kingdom, and that came at the people's expense. See, this has to do with more than taxes. Brothers and sisters, you see the word yoke in the Bible connotes the burden of servitude. The idea of we have just been laboring, we have been serving, and we have worn ourselves thin. Does that sound familiar? So many of us this morning have shown up with different burdens on our shoulders. Sometimes it feels like we can't go another step or another day, and we don't know how we're going to handle it all. Well, the good news this morning is we can look to God's word for an example. Perhaps in Rehoboam, it's an example of what not to do. But the good news is as we look to Jesus, we can see a better example, can't we? You see, some of us, when burdened, feel the need to burden others down. It's kind of like when you're in a bad mood, and then you open the window and discover it's a rainy day. Isn't that a good feeling? When you're in a bad mood and you discover it's a rainy day and you say, good, now everybody gets to be just as miserable as I am. Of course, this time of year, if we see a rainy day, we're running around in the rain at our house. We're grateful that we've saved a little bit of money, water in the garden. It's a different story. But you see, some of us, when burdened, we feel the need to burden others down. Do you know anybody like this? Please don't nudge your spouse. Now's not the time for that. Maybe it's a coworker. Perhaps it's a family member. You know they've got a lot on their plate, and boy, do they let you know it. As soon as something's wrong with them, whether it is something monstrous or something minuscule, they're letting the whole world know. And you just wonder, what is it that you have to be excited about, even in the midst of a storm? On the other hand, we also know people who are the very opposite, don't we? People who we know are carrying around chronic pain, perhaps even life-threatening illnesses, who maintain the unwavering, uncompromising joy of the Lord. See, isn't that an example worth following? Some of you know exactly that kind of person that I'm talking about. Some of us, when burdened, feel the need to burden others down, to weigh others down, drag others down with us. Kind of like Job, when everything really falls apart in his life, he says, I regret the day I was ever born. I wish that my birthday was erased from the calendar. I wonder if this is what was really going on with Rehoboam. Can you imagine stepping in to the shoes that Solomon left? People are going to be comparing you to David. All right, I've been here for a year and a half, and one of the concerns is, well, what about the preachers of the past? People are always comparing you to the last guy or the one before them. Can you imagine the kind of shoes that Rehoboam is stepping into, following after Saul and then David and Solomon? Kings that left some pretty monstrous shoes to fill. Now Rehoboam feeling the burden of the kingship. People are looking to him for what's going to happen in the country. After all, we're on the brink of a civil war at this point in Judah's history. This is the beginning of the divided kingdom. He felt that pressure and that weight. And what he chose to do was to weigh everybody else down with him. Brothers and sisters, there is a better alternative when you start to feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. You see, some of us, when burdened, we feel the need to burden others down. And yet some of us, like I mentioned earlier in the sermon, some of us, when burdened, feel the need to carry it all ourselves. And here in this image, you can see a man who's put 4 boulders on his back, and I can feel mine seizing up just looking at this picture, to be honest with you. Some of us, when burdened, we feel the need to carry it all ourselves. We don't want to let anybody know so as to convey that we're strong. Brothers and sisters, there's a difference, isn't there, between weighing other people down versus sharing the load, isn't there? There's a difference between complaining about all of the world's problems and admitting in humility, I need to share this with somebody. I need some help. I need some prayers. I can't do this all by myself. When Lucy was a little bit younger, she gave me a little smile. Yeah, I'm talking about you. When Lucy was younger, she had really developed this fierce independence. And for our Bible class teachers, if you have ever had the honor and the privilege of teaching Lucy in Bible class, you know what I'm talking about. In fact, she's probably a little different in Bible class than she is at home, if I'm going to be honest with you. Well, she reached this period of fierce independence, being the younger sister, after all, always trying to keep up with her older sister. And she developed a little catchphrase. And this catchphrase was, I can do it all my by self. Okay, not all by myself, all my by self. And so what she would do is emerge from her bedroom fully clothed. She had dressed herself for the day. The underwear are on inside out and backwards, and both legs are through the same hole. The shirt is on inside out and backwards and upside down, and I'm colorblind, but I'm pretty sure it has never once matched the pants that she's put on. And the shoes are on the wrong feet. There's 3 or 4 headbands and clippies in her hair, and she's gotten a little better at this recently. And she comes out grinning ear to ear like she is the princess of the universe because she had done it all by herself, or in her words, all my by self. Some of us, when we feel burdened, we feel the need to carry it all ourselves. She feels this burden of being the younger sister, trying to keep up with her older sister, and sometimes it looks a little goofy, and that's okay. For some of us, sometimes it's a little less humorous, isn't it? Sometimes this means we take on more than we can handle. Sometimes it means that we're drowning under the pressure, being crushed under the weight of just trying to show the world that we're strong. Who are we trying to impress? Brothers and sisters, we learn from Jesus himself that it's okay to share the load with others. You see, some of us, when burdened, we feel like we're being crushed, unable to move or function. And the good news this morning is God has given us an avenue with which to share our burdens. God has given us an outlet in which we can give him our every care. And he's given us brothers and sisters to walk this journey with us hand in hand, taking some of the load on their shoulders. You see, we sang a song last Sunday. The song is called Here in This Place. We're not singing it again this morning, so I'll solo it for you. Lay your burdens down. I won't solo it. You know what I'm talking about, right? This song is, lay your burdens down, every care you carry, and come to the table of grace. For there is mercy. Come just as you are, for we are all unworthy to enter the presence of God, for he is holy. Isn't that true? We sing, of course, as an encouragement to one another. We sang this last week. Did we mean it? Lift up your heart. Lift up your hands. Fall on your knees and pray. For the King of Kings and the joy he brings is here in this place. You see, for some of us, this past week has felt joyless. The burdens on our shoulders felt like it was the weight of the world. Perhaps we're mourning the loss of a loved one. I know who you are. Some of us this past week have heard some news from the doctor that we didn't want to hear. Some of us are managing chronic pain and illnesses. We wake up every morning wondering how we're going to make it through the day. Brothers and sisters, the Lord sees you in your pain, and he offers us relief, and he offers us hope that goes beyond this life. You see, the Bible says so much about this, doesn't it? Of course, Jesus himself says in Matthew chapter 11, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And he gives us a yoke. So it's not just about giving him our burdens. Listen to what Jesus says. He says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." See, there's a difference, isn't there, between having a manageable load that we rely on one another to help carry and giving our burden to the Lord versus having no burden whatsoever. You see, The Christian walk doesn't mean that we have no struggles. The Christian walk doesn't mean that there's no burden, no responsibility. In fact, there's some pretty serious responsibilities that come with following Christ, isn't there? You see, that call to love our enemies, I don't know that I'll ever get there. But this is the responsibility that Jesus has placed on our shoulders, to be a light, to be a witness. Of course, this is this yoke that Jesus is describing. The passage that was read for us just a moment ago from 1 Peter chapter 5, humble servants, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, cast all your anxieties on him, for he cares for you. Cast all your cares upon him might be another translation here. And here's why. It's this simple, guys, for he cares for you. This goes on and on and on. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, we're charged biblically to bear one another's burdens, aren't we? Did you see the story from the New York City Marathon last year of this particular gentleman who had run 26 miles? Of course, the marathon is 26.2 miles. He made it 26 miles. He had made a very good pace. He had to qualify and even in order to run this race in the first place. And right there, the finish line is at the is in his sight, from me to the back of the auditorium, and he collapsed. Those runners, some of course, as you see in this image, ran right by. There were 2 or 3 who neglected what the stopwatch had to say, though they might have been on pace to reach their goal time. They had expectations that they had prepared for months in advance in order to be able to run this race according to their standards. And instead, on this day, they saw someone who had fallen. They stopped everything to pick him up and run the rest of the race with him. This particular gentleman was interviewed afterward, and he said, "I'll never forget it for the rest of my life. And I hope that one day I can do that for others." So what should we learn from Rehoboam? On the one hand, yes, to accept godly counsel, to listen to those who have walked the walk before you. Young people, that means we've got to listen to our elders instead of thinking we can do it all by ourselves. It also means that we've got to listen to people who we might not necessarily totally agree with. We listen and have humility to hear what we don't want to hear. This is something that Grant and I have been talking about extensively in our Sunday morning class. How can we receive a rebuke from somebody, even if it's what we don't want to hear? How can we have that kind of humility that can handle that? Of course, Rehoboam's story is a good one to examine. What should we do when we have power and authority? How might we lead with gentleness and humility? What kind of burdens do we put on others? And yet, the question I want to leave you with this morning is, what will you do with your burden? This morning, you're not fooling anybody. None of us are. Each and every one of us has shown up with something heavy on our shoulders. In just a moment, I'm going to ask for a unique type of response this morning. If you've fallen asleep at this point in the sermon, now's the time to wake up, all right? Now, I'm going to ask the elders, some to be at the back and some to be at the front in just a moment. And we're not going to, whatever you might have to share, whatever your burden is this morning, we're not going to air it out from the pulpit for the whole church to hear and to put on Facebook Live for the whole internet to hear as well. That's not what we're doing this morning. If that's what you need, we'll honor that. But instead, if you've got a burden that's weighing on your shoulders this morning, I want to encourage you to put that on somebody else. Let somebody else help you carry the load as we lift these things up to prayer in God. I'm going to ask some of the elders at this time to make their way to the front and some to the back as well to help receive those who might want to respond this morning. The question is, what do you want to do with your burden? Some of us have work stress. Others have strained relationships with your family. Some of you are struggling with parenting. I know I am. Some of us have health issues that plague us, a daily burden you bear, and even for some, diagnoses that are life-threatening. That's a heavy load to bear. Can we bear it with you? Some of us are struggling with financial burdens. The list goes on, doesn't it? Here's the thing this morning. The Lord knows what you're struggling with. Can we share it with one another? We weep with those who weep. We rejoice with those who rejoice. What will you do with your burden this morning? Will you bring it to the feet of Jesus as we stand and sing?